With Poilievre, you looked at the numbers, right? And as soon as Poilievre started criticizing Trump, his poll numbers plummeted. It was almost like to the day when he started criticizing Trump, aligning himself on the Ukraine war, but really being outspoken against Trump, his numbers tanked in Canada. And then Trump comes out and endorses Mark Carney. And I don't know if it's the banking background or the China connection. I have no idea. I still to this day cannot wrap my head around why Trump endorsed Carney unless it was intentional sabotage and he was just trolling him.
Yeah, they do have some history in the financial world. Mark Carney's company bailed out a huge apartment complex owned by Jared Kushner. So there is a connection there. And Mark Carney and Trump have been better friends than they're pretending right now, which is, I think, is why Trump wasn't playing the game. He was saying, oh, good old Mark, the prime minister. Yeah, we know each other very well. Mark Carney was playing the game of we have to resist Donald Trump. And at the same time, even though Poilievre was criticizing Donald Trump, he was painted as the Canadian Trump, as the mini Trump, the Canadian version of Donald Trump. And to some extent, they do share some policies, but in other ways, they're not. And
well, how bad would it have been, David? I mean, how bad would it have been if he was? Because look at Canada right now, across all these markers right now. I mean, it's an unbelievable. We talk about homelessness, 10 cities, right? We're talking about rampant inflation across Canada, opioid deaths, Natalie talked about, right? Fentanyl crisis, ethics scandals, Chinese influence in the government, massive.
Rising abuse of power, rising cost of living, and yeah, you're right.
I'm reminded of like Costanza on that episode of Seinfeld. He's like, my whole life I've done something a certain way and I've been a total failure. He's like, what if I did the exact opposite? And he starts having incredible success. It's like, well, Canada has literally shot itself in the foot for the past 15, 20 years. Maybe they should try something else if everything else they've tried has failed.
I think if Poilievre had have just pulled the plug and taken some chances and stopped trying to appease the liberal media, I think it would have had a positive effect. Yeah. But they're so afraid of offending the liberal mainstream media in Canada. And this is why the first 3 weeks of that campaign were a disaster for Pierre Poilievre. It sounds like he felt he was entitled to win. He felt he couldn't lose. And he was listening very carefully to his campaign manager, who was consistently giving him bad advice. And I think he should have taken more chances. I think he should have really said, hey, we need some radical change in this country because we're on the verge of a complete economic collapse. And Mark Carney's not going to stop that. He's going to accelerate it. But I think Poilievre should have emphasized change, and the fact that we need drastic change in this country, not just tinkering around with things, not just a little bit of decrease in the immigration and a few cuts here and a few slashes of regulations here. We need a complete seismic change in this country because I don't know if we can survive Mark Carney. I wrote this today and I said it in my own broadcast. Alberta is on the verge of separating from Canada right now because they are sick and tired of net zero policies. They're sick and tired of equalization payments that they have to give every other province because they happen to be richer than those other provinces. There's 40% now support for separation. And that poll was taken 2 weeks ago. Now that Carney's in, I predict it's going to go up. And it's a very real possibility that Alberta could separate. That will be the end of Canada. It will be chaos after that.
Well, and we got to go. But I know, Mark Carney, one of the things he said, of course, today is that every policy decision fiscally has to be related to climate change and net zero policy, everything.
How do you like those blackouts, Europe? Canada coming soon to a province near you. Yeah,
Alberta. A lot of people in our chat room are saying, Alberta, we're ready to leave. We're ready to leave. We got a lot of.
Well, I'm just going to give you a victory point. Again, you called this when Trudeau stepped down. You knew that this was a shoe-in for another Liberal victory because if Pierre Poilievre had been running against Justin Trudeau, it would have been a very different story. And so I'm sorry, you're just sick about it. We're sick with you. But, that gives us a lot of work to do. You're going to have to keep coming back on Redacted because we're going to have to keep following what these a-holes do.
Well, and David, also, I should say this. You weren't in the tank for Poilievre. You were out there very critical of Poilievre many times, and you were pointing the finger and saying, hey, pay attention to Maxime Bernier. You were saying, hey, open up your eyes to where you were very critical of Poilievre on Ukraine and a whole host of issues. So, it's a sad day for Canada. But David, thank you so much. If you ever want to come down here to America, we have a guest room. We'll be able to take care of you.
You can seek taxation asylum.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, David. Great to see you.
All right. We have more news to get to.
Just had a micro power outage there, but it shuts down the computer. After the podcast, I'm going to find out why that's happening because the battery should be sustaining it. But there's a lot of stuff here, right? It's amazing, especially with the butterfly wing ones. I do kind of get this energy around me that can sometimes make it a little bit more difficult to podcast. Now, what I was saying was generally in politics, you want to get people from business, you want to get people from law, and from time to time, an academic is a good leader, okay? An economics professor or something like that. There's a few kinds of people you don't want leading a country. Military leaders. I don't think that's ever happened in the United States. Let me just check that for a sec, because I'm not quite sure. Has a military general ever been president of the United States? Yeah. Yes, multiple U.S. presidents have served as generals before their presidencies. Wow, boy, did I ever get this wrong. Specifically, 12 out of the 45 presidents who have served in the U.S. military also held the rank of general. Notable examples, George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, Dwight Eisenhower, Zachary Taylor, Andrew Jackson. But this was after becoming a general in the War of 1812. I think, so Eisenhower, I think, okay. I think he's the last one. But anyways, let me get back on track. One of the worst things that can happen is where you get a former director of the National Intelligence Agency as your leader. And to the best of my knowledge, this has only been George Bush Sr. And they've got it going on in Russia now because I don't think that Putin was the head of the KGB, though, but he comes from the KGB, right? Never good. I think the Cold War was at its most tense when Andropov was the premier of the United Soviet Socialist Republics. And he had been the head of the KGB. Okay? And the other guy you don't want is a central banker. Okay? You want people to sort of stay in their lane and be specialists at something. Okay? Hang on. Let me just ask a question here. Has a chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve ever subsequently been president of the United States? Pretty sure the answer is no, but we'll see. No chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve has ever subsequently become the president of the United States. Has a governor of the Bank of Canada ever subsequently become Prime Minister of Canada? Has a governor of the Bank of Canada ever subsequently become Prime Minister of Canada? And Mark Carney is the first, okay? So these are unprecedented times, okay? I really don't know how to express this, okay? I really don't know how to say this without being, caustic, without tapping into my my cultural roots, which I'm loath to do most times because it's too much. It's like overkill, right? But Um, hang on a sec. Let me just check England. Has there ever been an instance where the governor of the Bank of England has become Prime Minister of England? I don't think so. Okay. No. No. So this is really uncharted territory. Generally, people who make their bones in the financial world, and to be the governor of a central bank of a nation is the highest status you can achieve, okay? Now, Carney is loaded with conflicts of interest. Now, he's representing Canada, but before running in the election, he moved all of his assets to New York, right? Jared Kushner and Donald Trump's home turf. So I'll be fucked if I know what's going on here, and I'm not going to pretend that I do, because I don't. But what tonight's podcast is about is occult aristocracy, and we're going to look into that a little bit more closely. So Mark Carney is the first governor of the Bank of Canada and the first head of a central bank in the triumvirate of the UK, Canada, and the United States to become prime minister. And it's very, very rare. He is the godfather of Chrystia Freeland's child, the former finance minister, but she didn't have a financial background. She was actually a journalist and really one of the most incompetent finance ministers we've had. But the more you look into this, the more you start to see these occult fraternal lines. Okay? And what I mean by that is these people are all part of the same circles. Okay. Now we're going to get on to point, okay? And I'm just going to read from something that came across my way, which I think is worth listening to, okay? Because the one thing we do know is that this is not business as usual. And the one thing that we do know is that we're not being told the truth. We're being told something and then something else is being done, okay? So here we go. What is unfolding in Canada is not politics, not reform. It's a hostile takeover by global forces using one of the most sophisticated and destructive plans ever devised to collapse a free society from within. Plan is referred to as the Cloward-Piven strategy. The man they have chosen to complete this agenda is Mark Carney. Mark Carney was not elected, he was selected. His loyalty is not to the Canadian people. It's to the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and the Bank for International Settlements, and other unelected global institutions that aim to erase national sovereignty and individual freedom. The Cloward-Piven strategy, in definition, aims to utilize militant anti-poverty groups to facilitate a political crisis by overloading the welfare system through an increase in welfare claims, forcing the creation of a system of guaranteed minimum income and redistributing through income through the federal government. In 1966, Columbia University professors Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven developed an 8-point strategy to collapse a free nation from within intentionally. Their idea was to overwhelm the system through massive economic and social destabilization so that citizens would beg for authoritarian control in exchange for survival. This strategy has now been adapted and weaponized by global financial elites and is being applied to Canada right now. If you've never heard of the Cloward-Piven strategy, it doesn't matter. It's already being implemented for you. You're not imagining the chaos. It is designed to demoralize you, to confuse you, and to make you submit. Mark Carney is the chosen executor. Below are the 8 points of the Cloward-Piven strategy, along with concrete actions Carney has taken to implement each one. 1. Overload and bankrupt the welfare system. In 2020, during the COVID-19 lockdowns, Carney publicly supported massive government stimulus spending, including the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which gave more than 8 million Canadians free money with no strings attached. This program cost over 81 billion Canadian dollars. Carney, in a July 2020 speech to the London School of Economics, called these types of stimulus packages essential tools for transition and praised the role of public finance in accelerating the shift to stakeholder capitalism. He's a big believer in this stakeholder capitalism. The COVID-19 lockdowns were not about public health. They were all about creating permanent dependency. The more individuals rely on government support, the more control the government has. They don't go as dark as I do in spiritual economics, okay? So I'll make my points at the end, but let's read what the amateur cynics think, okay? And I'm a professional cynic. This is an amateur cynic, okay? But the amateur cynic is a stepping stone to the professional cynic, okay? And the professional cynic is one, I'm not really cynical. I see the multidimensional nonsense. I know what's going on. They can't pull the wool over my eyes. I've seen it, I can't unsee it, and I'm going to speak about it, okay? So number 1 is overload and bankrupt the welfare system. The COVID-19 lockdowns weren't about public health. They were about creating permanent dependency. More individuals rely on government support, the more control the government has. All true. Canada's debt has now reached more than $1.5 trillion. Now remember, we're only a country of 40 million people. Okay? So that's an enormous amount of money. The system is being driven toward bankruptcy by design. And you could see this. This was also what Biden and Harris were working on. Okay? Once you're aware of it, you see it everywhere. Okay? And I've been saying this for quite some time on the Talamanca Review, that it seems to me that there is the intent to collapse the system. Okay? And it's not for the betterment of the poor. I think that's a noble idea, helping the poor if they can be helped. But Canada has been a welfare state for decades, and it's just getting worse now. Okay? It's got to be one of the best countries in the world to be a drug addict in. It's just, there's so much free shit. It's unbelievable. Number 2, raise the cost of living until survival becomes the only focus. In February 2021, Carney co-authored a report for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, where he pushed for removing capital from carbon-based industries and redirecting it into climate-compliant investments. Biggest scam in the world, okay? They're starting to audit. The DOGE system is starting to audit these green funds, and they're like the Ukraine assistance money. Where did it go? There's nothing to show for the money. They're just disappearing the money, which is another arm of collapsing the system, okay? The direct outcome of this has been a reduction in oil and gas supply, spiking prices across the board. In July 2022, Carney's climate agenda began affecting Canadian energy producers when major banks stopped issuing loans to oil and gas firms unless they complied with net zero targets. With fuel prices soaring, Canadians now face historic inflation. Food banks across the country report record demand. In Canada, the cost of groceries has increased from March 2020 to March 2025 approximately 30.2% in total. I'd say that's conservative. And that's across the board, so it would include food products that have not increased in price, okay? Like oatmeal, But then when you look at certain specific industries, like meat, it's almost impossible to get meat in Canada now, okay? Carney knows these policies crush the middle class. That's the point. When individuals struggle to feed their families or fill their gas tanks, they stop resisting, okay? Defund and destabilize law enforcement. On June 8th, 2020, just days after the death of George Floyd in the United States, Mark Carney wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail. For those of you who aren't Canadian, that's one of the biggest daily newspapers in Canada, national newspapers, endorsing social movements that called for defunding police. In that article, he promoted the idea that institutions need to be reformed to serve social justice rather than law and order. His exact words were that the economy must become more inclusive and must reflect new social priorities. There's that word inclusive again. By the way, his daughter, one of his children is transitioning. So one of Carney's own children is involved in this sex change nonsense, okay? This is how deeply invested he is in this agenda, which is ancillary to the Black Star cult, okay? This is all Black Star cult stuff, even if they don't know they're in the Black Star cult, okay? In Canada, this narrative led to police budget reductions in major cities, including Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. And the result has been a significant rise in violent crime, carjackings, and open drug use. As cities become less safe, public demand increases for technological surveillance, biometric security, and government monitoring. Carney has supported the digital ID infrastructure that will replace traditional policing with algorithmic control. Number 4, control education to indoctrinate the next generation. In October 2020, Carney became the head of the Brookfield ESG Advisory Group, which has since partnered with the United Nations to fund youth education programs across North America. These programs are designed to train children and university students to accept climate compliance, equity mandates, and global governance as normal. In March 2023, the University of Toronto received millions in funding tied to a Brookfield-based ESG curriculum. These classes redefine economic freedom as dangerous and promote submission to centralized digital control. The youth of Canada are no longer being educated, they are being conditioned. Number 5. These are the 5 points of the Cloward Piven program. So you give the point, and then you give an example of Carney fulfilling it. So the author is writing a thesis here. Eliminate private property through regulation, taxation, and debt traps. Carney supports net zero home compliance. In April 2023, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation proposed mandatory energy audits for homes before sale. This policy was developed in part by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which Carney chairs. These audits will be used to justify carbon taxes on homeowners, making it impossible for many families to sell or afford upgrades. At the same time, interest rate hikes driven by central banks have doubled mortgage payments since early 2022. Carney supports these hikes as necessary to curb inflation. The result is mass foreclosure. This is not mismanagement. This is extraction. 6. Promote division through identity politics. Carney has repeatedly made public statements aligning with social justice narratives. In May 2021, he gave a speech at the Public Policy Forum where he called for economic systems that serve racial justice, climate justice, and gender equity. These are not neutral goals. They are designed to divide individuals and pit them against one another based on race, gender, and ideology. While Canadians fight over perceived slights, and identity labels, the real theft is happening quietly. Carney's controllers benefit from the chaos. The more fractured society becomes, the easier it is to dominate. 7. undermine faith in family to replace them with state loyalty. In 2019, Carney spoke at the Vatican in support of the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, a group designed to unite global corporations, financial institutions, and the Catholic Church under a single moral economic framework. The message was clear. Loyalty must shift from traditional institutions to a centralized system where moral authority is dictated by economic compliance. At the same time, Canadian government programs now incentivize children to bypass parental consent on gender decisions, vaccines, and personal health records. Carney supports these policies. They remove the parent and insert the state. So you see the continuity of the occult aristocracy, right? You remember in 2016 on the campaign trail where Hillary Clinton says it takes a village to raise a child? They want everything now. Okay? And I'll spare you tonight why they want access to your children. You can probably guess. Okay? But that's the real reason. Because the Black Star cult takes that energy in, just the way a dying star sucks in even the light around it. Okay? They want the light of youth. They want the energy of youth. They want everything. Okay? This is Black Star politics right in your face. Okay? And again, the occult aristocracy, you've got Brookfield bailing out, or Carney's financial institution bailing out Jared Kushner and by the way, Jared Kushner is one of the biggest slumlords in New York. He's a bona fide, 19th century slumlord. Okay? Doesn't give a shit about people. But he's Mark Carney's friend. And Mark Carney is going around saying he gives a shit about people. You can't make this shit up. I dare you to even try. Okay? Now, number 8, and probably the most odious, create permanent dependence on the state through programmable money. Carney is one of the most vocal international advocates for central bank digital currencies. In a December 29 speech at the Bank for International Settlements, Carney said that the future of money will be programmable and trackable and must support sustainable development. In October 2023, the Bank of Canada began pilot testing a central bank digital currency. Carney is advising that effort. Once implemented, this programmable currency will allow the government to freeze accounts, limit purchases, and control every financial transaction. There will be no cash, no privacy, and no freedom. Think about what Justin Trudeau did in the trucker convoy and times it by 10. That's how potent this system will be. There will be no more resistance to these people. Facial recognition software will see you at protests. Immediately your access to your cash will be frozen. You will have to go through a lengthy, frustrating bureaucratic process to eat again. Okay? This is the Fabian socialist reality predicted and endorsed, by the way, by George Orwell. Because George Orwell wasn't telling us about them. George Orwell was one of them. Okay? As was Aldous Huxley. Okay? I mean, this is... The only thing that still amazes me is more people don't see this. That's what I don't get. It's like, why am I here alone with very few people to talk to who don't see what I see when it's in neon now, when they're putting spotlights on it? And it's all out there. You just got to do a little bit of research. You'll see it all. Okay? And you just got to connect a few dots the way I did. And 1972 set this up. So if you think we're accidentally stumbling into this because of a pandemic that, by the fate of God, entered into our world in 2020, you're fucking nuts. This goes back to 1972 and all the work I've done on the Telemancer Review explaining all the stuff that happened in 1972 or thereabouts. Adding the addendum of the Mansfield Amendment to the Defense Procurement Act to accentuate how corporations would take over the world. You can't make this shit up. This is the full Cloward-Priven strategy. These are not theories, these are documented facts. And Mark Carney is being placed into the Canadian federal election to finish the job. All right? I am now witnessing the death of my country. which my family has lived in since about 1798. It's distressing, to say the least. Even though I'm fully relocated in another country now, I live my life in another language, Spanish, but nonetheless, it's distressing. I am distressed by this. So the occult is aristocracy are the bloodlines involved in this takeover of the world. Okay? And at the center of it is the Temple of Solomon. Okay? And if you want, all of these, everything goes to the rabbis and the Temple of Solomon. That is not ancillary. That is central. Okay? Central. Anyways, this has been Occult Aristocracy. I'm Bruce McDonald. Thank you for listening to the Talamanca Review.